Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly Hardy, and it's my great pleasure and honor to spend the next hour with you. Um, I'm a senior program officer in the Division of Preservation and Access at the National Endowment for the Humanities. And today I'm very excited to share with you some ideas and opportunities about special collections at historically Black colleges and universities. As the home of much of Black intellectual life for almost 2 centuries, HBCUs are home to some of the most important written, printed, and illustrated records in the United States. As the stewards of these collections, HBCUs at once have many opportunities and face many obstacles in the preservation and access of these treasures. These materials are, I would argue, more important than ever, and I'd like to take a moment to say why in relation to the A More Perfect Union initiative that we have here at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Preparation for the anniversary of the founding of the United States in 1776 are returning scholarly and public discourse alike to temporally based historical inquiries that are shaping and reshaping our understanding of sites of revolution and of settlement. In the public conversation, the New York Times 1619 Project offers perhaps the most ambitious use of the measure of time to mark a moment, reframing, in the words of its founder, Nicole Hannah Jones, quote, the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative, end quote. The 1619 Project offers us a number of alternative models for recognizing 1776 without uncritically celebrating a singular laudatory historical narrative, or without eschewing its importance as the year of our nation's founding, or without turning the semi-sequential into a parade of sins. One way to navigate this terrain of competing absolutes is to surface competing and complementary histories, to create access as well as to preserve the evidence of many types of American experiences. I really can't think of a better place to begin to address such questions than the libraries and archives of HBCUs. These are the institutions that have been, since the late 19th century, to borrow the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, quote, the organs of that fine adjustment between real life and the growing knowledge of life, an adjustment which forms the secret of civilization, end quote. The clues to that secret I'd like to posit to you today is likely sitting on your campus, on the stacks of library shelves, in boxes of letters, or files of newspaper clippings that often go ignored. Before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge the HBCU Library Alliance, whose work has made possible much of this presentation and discussion today. I relied heavily on its digital repository, which celebrates the founding of the historically Black college of historically Black the founding of historically Black colleges and universities through its online collection of primary resources from these libraries and universities. This digital repository, whose URL I have posted in the slide here, includes several thousand scan pages and represents HBCU Library's first collaborative effort to make these collections digitally available. The repository includes photographs, university correspondence, manuscripts, images of campus buildings, alumni letters, memorabilia, and programs from campus events. These images present HBCUs as cultural, social, and political institutions from the early 1800s until today. And I encourage you to check out the repository after our discussion today. I should note, too, that the HBCU Library Alliance is supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities by an NEH grant from our Office of Challenge Programs, and that is called Building Capacity for Humanities Special Collections at Historically Black Colleges and Universities. So today, rather than telling you how valuable and important HBCU collections are, I'd like us to explore together a few items that I've selected for us to scrutinize. Insofar as is possible in this Zoom environment, I'd like to make the session interactive by discussing with you, rather than talking at you, about 4 objects I've chosen from 4 different HBCU collections. For each item, I'll briefly introduce it. Then I'd like to please hear from you in the chat. So I can't actually hear anything you say the way that the setup is, but I can see everything that you post in the chat. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to participate through the chat. Okay, so for each item, I'm gonna pose a series of questions, and they'll be the same questions each time. I will ask that you address these questions. Ideally, we'll go in order from initial observations about the item to imagined uses to considerations of preservation and then of access needs that each object might require. I'm eager to hear any of your thoughts, however, so please don't feel like we must move in order of the questions that I've presented. So as long as we're talking about that object, that'll be great. My hope is that we'll spend 5 to 7 minutes discussing each item, and I'm going to go ahead and post these questions in the chat so that as I move through the items, you will always be able to refer to the questions. So we'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes discussing each item, and then I'll move us on to the next item. So as I say, there are 4 that I'm hoping we'll get to. After we are done, I will offer some specifics about NEH funding and support for archives and libraries. And then I'm hoping there'll be plenty of time for any questions that you have at the end. So without further ado, let's go digging into the archives, starting with okay, so this is a poster proclaiming a course of lectures by Locke, a teacher, philosopher, author, and critic in the first half of the 20th century. Locke emerged as a spokesperson of the New Negro movement, which of course now we know as the Harlem Renaissance. Upon publication in 1925 of The New Negro, an anthology of fiction, poetry, and essays on African and African American art and literature of the time. Dedicated to the success of Howard University, Locke taught and cultivated Black intellectual life as a professor of philosophy there. In 1916, with the support of the campus chapter of the NAACP, Locke delivered a series of 5 lectures, collectively known as Race, Contacts, and Interracial Relations. In these lectures, Locke offers an assault on biological race, urging a focus an assault on biological race, urging a focus instead on racial inequalities, which are the result of historical, social, and economic factors, he argued. So let's take a look at this poster here, which is part of the Elaine Locke collection at the Moreland Springer Research Center of Howard University. Again, please turn your attention to the questions I've posed in the chat, and I'd love to see responses in the chat if you'd be willing. So starting with initial observations. What do you notice about this poster? Have you ever seen anything like it? Where do you imagine that what do you imagine it was used for? Would love to hear from anyone who's willing to participate here in the chat. And I'll give it a few moments. Yeah, exactly. Great. So one person pointed out that both just the aging process, right, of such paper and other acid producing elements can harm the quality of this document. That's an excellent thing to point out, right? That especially in the early 20th century, it's funny, sometimes older paper, which, was hand woven, so 18th century paper can actually be it's much more durable. The early 20th century paper tends to be, it was made incredibly cheaply. It's wood pulp paper. And so, yeah, it deteriorates really easily, right? And so any contact with other acid elements, right, can really cause damage to it. What else? That's a great starting observation. You start to think about, yeah, great, that the digitization of it really leads to greater access, right? So that we can see it, right? We can know the topics, right? Good. Great. Great. So the involvement of the NAACP, and that we know that Du Bois and Locke had certain differences, right? Certainly, but that this was really an area that they uh, came together on. Yeah, mention about tagging it appropriately. So we see what we would call now a digital watermark, right? Where there's this these white lines through it. And I intentionally wanted, I mean, that's really important, right? That we know that this is part of Howard's collection, right? And that when we show it, we make it clear that it is. Um, uh, Great, that learning more about Locke's role, right? That he had this, that he was a vital part of Howard's campus, Howard's intellectual life, and of course also had this incredible it was a growing national reputation. I mean, this is before. So if the New Negro was published in 25, this is 1916. So this is 9 years before. Great. It was a way of informing the public of his lecture as well. So that Howard's functioning not just as a university campus for the students there, but also as a community center, right, for Washington, D.C., right? We're in the nation's capital. Howard is right there. And so this is a way, too, of, sort of tone down relations, if I may. Uh, and and this is a way too of sort of making Howard a center, right, the Mecca, right, the center of Black intellectual life. Um, this is great. Great. Okay, great. So, right, in what ways, yeah, can we anticipate audience here too, as well, right? That this is for Howard students, right? That it's on campus. As I say, it certainly would have been open to the public, we can assume, but also that we can start to say, like, it seems like students in 1916 would have been interested in this, or else they wouldn't have asked him to do this special. Great. Oh, that's so great. Thank you. The growing new era after Booker T. Washington's 1915 death. That's excellent. And we're sort of going to be moving back in time, starting here with Locke, and then actually the last item that we'll be looking at will really bring us to earlier to Booker T. Washington's moment. It could have been published in a student newspaper, exactly, but of course, and I was really frustrated. I couldn't find the dimensions of this online. So thinking, about digitization and space, or size rather, right? Everything looks like the size of your computer screen. And I really wanted to know, how big was this, right? Like, was it a big poster that got hung up, etc.? Yeah, great point about the social science club. Exactly. That they're getting taught billing. Exactly. That's a really cool thing to point out. What was that organization, right? That would be a great question to ask, right? And was that a way of sort of saying, like, oh, the social science club is in on this? Yeah, and the NAACP, whatever, but the cool kids at the social science club are involved in this. So we got to be at this lecture, right? I mean, just imagine the way that this is sort of part of student life, as I say, part of kind of this discursive moment. Yeah, and as someone else pointed out too, that it was, very much that we can assume a certain amount of interest in this, or else it would not have happened, right? Fortunately, the collection includes the manuscript and the typescript of these lectures, and they were published, I think about 20 years ago, published as a collected book. So you can look them up and actually read them now in a book format. But as I say, really important moment that we kind of get a window into from this archival object. Okay, that was so fun. Great. The idea of a practice of race is striking. Very good. Conveys that race isn't static and universally experienced experience but constructed. That's beautiful. Thank you. That's a great kind of bookend to this conversation, because that's exactly what part of Locke's important intervention, right? Let's get away from this biological static understanding of race and understand it as a complete historical construction. So the theoretical and scientific conceptions of race, right? These are conceptions, they're not actualities. So wonderful. Thank you all so much. Great. A+ on that one. Okay, let's keep moving. So there are our questions. So next we're going to go to Spelman College. And here we have, this photograph was taken just a decade after Sophia B. Packard and Harriet E. Giles founded the Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary in the basement of the Friendship Baptist Church. An advertisement ran in the Atlanta newspapers that announced, quote, "Colored women and girls, on Monday next, April 11th, instruction prepared by religious principals will be given in all the usual branches. It is hoped that they will have a full school as they labor both to develop the mind and to save the souls of their pupils," end quote. So Packard and Giles' vision soon became a reality, and they began planning a full-scale liberal arts school. Full-scale liberal arts college. With a few more teachers and a gift of $250, all of $250 from John D. Rockefeller, the school would soon move to its current site, a former Army barracks, and be renamed after Rockefeller's wife's family, the Spelman Seminary, and then later Spelman College. In 1883, the model school opened to train student teachers, and it is these academic graduates that we see photographed here. The same year that this photograph was taken, Spelman College opened its first library in Packard Hall, known as the Quarles Library, named for Pastor Frank Quarles, who had offered the basement of his Baptist church for the school's first meeting of 11 students, 10 women, some formerly enslaved, and 1 girl. So let's turn our attention to the photograph, which, as I say, is part of the Spelman College archive. And again, let's return to the questions. I'll just flip to them one more time, just to kind of get some ideas here of what we might talk about. So again, initial observations, the uses of the document, and then thinking through its preservation and access. Great. So we already have some comments about the deterioration of the document. Exactly. Exactly, it's painfully evident, right? It's being carefully preserved. So this is photography, and this is really early photography, right? So we can see the deterioration on the paper around it. The photograph itself presumably has gone through some fading, but it doesn't look like the actual integrity of the document has been compromised. Exactly, it takes really careful preservation, and particularly cold climates and control of humidity. The beauty and the dignity of these women, absolutely. Absolutely, right? They are dressed to the nines, right? And then look what is in each of their hands, too. I'd love to discuss that. Yeah, it does look like there might be some light damage. I agree with that. It's hard to tell, right? We're looking, of course, at a digitized image of a photograph, and I am so grateful, and I think most of us are, for these digital surrogates. But of course, there's no replacing, spending time with the original, when we'd really be able to discern more of the ways in which the photograph may have changed over the last 130 years or so since it was first produced. There are graduates other than academic graduates. Yes, exactly. That's so great. The genealogical uses of these archives are huge, right? Especially women's genealogy, which can be particularly hard to trace, of course, because of, changing names with marriage, right? And so the idea of the maiden name, that sometimes can be really hard to produce. But when one finishes, at the age of 18 or 19 or 20 at Spelman Seminary or Spelman College, presumably they would still have that original family name that they were given. And so this as a resource for genealogical research, that's a great, great thing to point out. Yes, and they are presenting themselves. Thank you, Rachel Hicks points out that they're presenting themselves with such great pride, right? They have much to be proud of, indeed, indeed. What's in their hands? Look at what each of them has in their hands. Can you see that? I'm sorry that it is maybe a little tough for you all. But this was one of the first things that I noticed about this photograph. What is everybody holding? Yeah, they've got books in their hands. Exactly, exactly. And maybe Bibles. The first thing I noticed was books, because that's what I tend to notice. And and then learning that it was the year that the library opened, and I can't help think that that's not an accident, right? So the library's just opened all of a sudden, presumably. There's a surfeit of books on campus for the first time, maybe, that all of us, hopefully they've had some donated. I don't know enough about how Coral's library was set up, but in order to call it a library, they at least had to have some collection of books. And lo and behold, each of the graduates gets a book to hold in her hand for this, for this graduation picture. I just thought that was such a lovely kind of tribute to their learning, right? It's such a significant way. And then, of course, there's a wonderful way to think too about the history of African Americans and African American women in particular, and their relationship to books, starting with Phyllis Wheatley's, that famous frontispiece that was published with her first collection of poems of her, writing at her writing desk. So the ways in which there's a certain genealogy to this kind of photograph as well. And then, of course, the photo is a collection, right? And it's a photograph of collections, right? Collections in use. That's another sort of meta element that I thought was kind of cool here. Other things about this, let me just return to the questions really quickly just to see if that sparks any more thoughts from anybody. So one person saying, I thought about which women had access to this incredible opportunity. What evidence is there of social strata they come from in the 1880s and 1890s? That's a great question. Exactly. We see here, people are very dressed up as they would be on their graduation day, or, but is that, what does that dress signify? And I have to say, I don't know enough about late 19th century dress to really be able to piece out the different fabrics and things that we're seeing. Lots of parasols, and also in that advertisement, it does mention. I think I didn't read that part to you, but there is prices mentioned, right? So like who can afford, who has the time, right, to go to school, and then also who can afford the tuition, which of course was very modest even by those standards, and yet still, it wasn't necessarily available to everybody. Great, good. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I totally agree that a journalist or person writing for a public audience could find great use for this photograph. Exactly. Just the importance of Black intellectual life during Reconstruction, right? It just seems like a story that sometimes gets lost as we think about all of the atrocities that happened during Reconstruction. But that also there was a very vibrant Black intellectual life that places like Spelman Seminary were creating, were fostering. So, and then yes, exactly. So the ways in which someone is talking here about, to reduce further erosion, thinking about digitization as part of an act of preservation, that there are ways in which we might preserve the original, and we sort of want to keep, it's clearly, it's mounted on a piece of paper, and if a conservator, again going back to the idea of acid, right, if a conservator deems that paper okay, maybe it is very high acid and it would be better for the photograph to come off of it, or maybe it's okay. And the fact too that it looks like maybe it came out of some sort of book or something like that, so to know the context in which it was originally mounted, if you will, the photograph was mounted to be preserved and shown, and then the ways in which we can enhance it electronically. Exactly. So some of that light distortion that we talked about at the beginning, we might be able to actually sort of get it closer, digitally speaking, without altering the original at all, but get it closer to the way it would have looked in 1891. It's really amazing what can be done with that. Great. This is great. Du Bois reported 6,000 African American attendees at HBCUs and PWIs by 1900, whose descendants now are nearly all with longstanding roots here. Everyone can find ancestors to research. That's great. That's great. Thank you for saying that. Okay, great. So let's move on. I'm just going to keep us moving here. Okay, so speaking of Du Bois, that was a perfect setup. Okay, so this next object might be slightly less familiar at first blush than the previous two, though its content is of course very familiar as maybe the cornerstone of 20th century African American thought, especially as it relates to HBCUs. Right? W.E.B. Du Bois needs no introduction, and yet it's worth reminding us of his dedication to HBCUs as illustrated in the brief excerpt from The Souls of Black Folk, which I quoted earlier. And of course, he has an extensive section on Fisk and on Atlanta University. So a graduate of Fisk and a professor at Atlanta University, Du Bois dedicated his life to the intellectual advancement of African Americans in the South. Originally from Massachusetts, Du Bois left a vast archive that resides at the library named for him at UMass Amherst. Fisk University, however, holds the original stereotype plates for his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folks. On the 20th of January, 1903, Du Bois signed a contract with A.C. McClurg, a Chicago publisher, for 10% royalty over 500 copies of his books, which was to be sold at a retail price of between $1 and $1.20. And the copyright was vested entirely in Du Bois. These plates are a symbol of his ownership of his literary production, just as William Wells Brown carried his stereotypes with him to London on his abolition tour a century earlier. But they're not just a symbol. These plates are the material manifestation of one's right to reproduce one's work, right? So we can see here, I have these were taken by a friend actually, some just so you can get a sense of how these plates exist. So this is one on display at Fisk, but then these are actually how they are stored. So these are the original plates used for the printing. Okay, so again, let's think through, right? It's not a photograph. It's not a manuscript. But I still would argue that it's hugely, hugely important. So let's look at our questions again. And I would just invite you to share any thoughts that you have about these printing plates that are at Fisk. Would humidity be a problem? Could be. Yeah, they are much less fragile. I think that's a really good thing to point out, right? We're not in the world of, this is metal, right? So yeah, fire, even fire, they do okay. But yeah, these, yes, exactly, the workmanship, exactly, the hours it would take to produce these plates, right? So the idea here is we've moved from this moment of, individual pieces of type, right? That then from the hand press period to creating these metal plates, because you're going to want to reprint this book so many times, right? What would be the value of having these plates? Yeah, what a jewel of a collection. Agreed. Absolutely agreed, Dr. Torres. Absolutely. If you were going to do a new edition of The Souls of Black Folk, right, in 2021, what might be the value of going to look at these plates? Great. Yeah, absolutely. A great opportunity to talk about evolving technologies of print and knowledge sharing. Absolutely. Thank you for that observation. Right. And also the evolution of the book itself, right? That we have here, these are the original proofs. Exactly. Later editions would have had additional proofing. Exactly. So you can really, really get back to this sort of original moment of creation, right? This is the first physical substantiation that can be reproduced of, as I say, possibly the most important text of the 20th century, right? The book that would establish the color line, the whole idea of the veil, and that you can this is as close as we can get in some sense. Exactly. Yeah, you all say things so much better than I do. The significant impact of this book would be everlasting, and the beauty to preserve its existence is extraordinary. Yeah, wood boxes, are they fireproof protection? How many? I don't know actually exactly how many plates there are. There's a plate for every page. Would be one way of saying it, but also, I don't know about the front matter and the back matter, so we don't know exactly how many. Um, Editing through traditions would be labor intensive, right? Exactly. And so the ways in which, exactly, that's really important point to point out about the sort of evolution of the text, that once you have plates, you have an edition that you want to reproduce, and changes become really more difficult in some sense. It becomes labor intensive. It's not something you do just cause, right? And so if you're looking at sort of like the ways in which the text evolved, because it went through, I think by 1950 it had gone through almost 25 editions. I mean, this was, as we know, a wildly popular text, and they almost couldn't keep up with the demands on it. To address about the fireproof wooden boxes, I agree. I mean, obviously, wood is not fireproof. These plates would probably do okay for a while. I mean, eventually metal will melt, right? But yeah, we might think about the ways in which, in an ideal scenario, would the wooden boxes, which I don't think you'd want to lose because they're the original cases, right? They themselves are archival objects, we might say. And yet you might want to put them in some sort of safe box or something like that, so that they would not be harmed in the devastating event of fire. But yeah, I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything, and if there's anything else anyone else wants to add. Yeah, preservation of knowledge to pass on to future generations. That's sort of what it's all about. That's excellent. Thank you. The DLC for just a second. I don't want to spend too much more time on these because I do want to keep moving, but digitization of these. What would that entail, right? I mean, I've got some pictures, right? A lovely shot of you know, a beautiful shot from the gallery, right? A piece of a beautiful exhibit. Exactly. I mean, these things are stunning looking, and you can see, right, the sorrow songs, right? So the actual musical notation, that was part of the reason I had to pick that one, because that's so cool, right? The way that musical notation was also printed, as we know, at the beginning of chapters, and also there's a whole cool conversation about whether the sorrow songs were going to be included and all this kind of thing. But that's but we see from the plates they sure were, and that was its own kind of craft. But also, thinking about, so again, these are friend of a friend's pictures of these. Nothing professional here, just to give you a sense of these collections. But it's just really neat to think about what would it mean to digitize these, and would there be a value to that, or is this more really about sort of this cool, beautiful materiality? So I don't have a definitive answer. I think I think both and, to be honest with you. But the minimalism is impactful. That's a really lovely way to put it. Exactly. Great. Okay. All right. One more left. Y'all are doing great. Thank you so much for playing along with me here. Okay. All right. So with Booker T. Washington, I promised you we'd get back to Booker T. Washington as its first teacher. Tuskegee was founded in 1881 as a normal and industrial school to train young Black men and women in various trades. Among these trades was printing. Here we see George Chapman, left, of Bessemer, Alabama, and Lodi's Arbertha of Warren, Arkansas, as they prepare a Mealy cylinder automatic number 41 press for a run. So photographs of printing offices and other scenes of trade education survive from several historically Black colleges. Booker T. Washington included photographs of students printing in his book, The Story of My Life and Work. The printing office at Tuskegee appears to have operated like a local jobbing printer for the institute itself. Printing was the earliest industrial trade taught at the school, which already had a hand press in 1884, right? So just 3 years after its founding, it already had a press up and running. In his autobiography, Washington describes the products Tuskegee students learned to print, quote, blanks, checks, catalogs, promissory notes, diploma blanks, minutes of associations and conventions, annual reports, bill and letterheads, envelopes, circulars, handbills, invitations, business cards, certificates, et cetera, with samples of 2 monthly papers, which were then printed at the institution as well. One was called the Southern Letter and the other the Gleaner. So Washington's list here encompasses nearly everything a school would need for its administrative purposes and what a student might need to learn before seeking work in the trade. So here we are. Let's stop and consider this archival object and what it tells us, right? Yes, exactly. The black press, keepers of culture. Exactly. That's exactly what we're thinking about here. The ways in which, right, like you're teaching a trade, but you're also teaching a way in which, African Americans are going to be intimately involved in the uh, both the preservation and, I mean, printing. If we're talking about digitization as an act of preservation, we can also think about printing as an act of preservation, right? Yeah, exactly. A picture where people could conceivably still be alive. Exactly, exactly. And that can come with complications around digitization, right? Because I took this from the HBCU Library Alliance, I knew that those permissions had been secured to some extent, but it is something to really be thoughtful about, right? What other ways might someone use this image? How would you maybe use it in a classroom, or why would you use it in a classroom? Oh, very cool point. Rachel Hicks says the evolution of oral tradition to documenting history, right? And if these printing presses are at institutions where Black life and Black intellectual life and Black intellectual cultural life are being taught, they can also be printed, right? Exactly, the power of the printed word. Lovely, very nicely said. Illustrates how both trades and Christianity were key components of the broadly liberal arts HBCU education. That's an excellent point, right? That the two could be seen in kind of in tandem, right? We often, in this sort of binary with Booker T, we often think of, trades and these normal schools, and of course that's the beauty of printing, is that it kind of crosses both. It's both a trade as well as a cultural endeavor. And Pamela says, yes, trailblazers of early innovation. Exactly. That there was a press there as early as 1884 at Tuskegee, that is to say. And the fact too that Booker T. Washington, I brought up the fact that he, included these images in his autobiography, right? Because I think, I don't know, but I think that we can say that he was proud of this work, right? And that he was proud that the students themselves were so involved in it from the very beginning, right? And there are wonderful photographs, as I say, both in the HBCU Library Alliance, in their digital repository of presses, both at Tuskegee and at other schools. Again, we're in the world of photography, so just thinking about preservation, right? I missed a comment earlier that I think is a really important one. Topics for students might explore, once African Americans were trained in these new colleges and institutions, who hired them? Where did they work? What barriers did they face, right? So these images are particularly important in sort of recovering African American printing history, right? And so we know that this training was going on at these schools as early as the 1880s. But then, what happened after you got trained at Tuskegee? Where did you go work? What sort of job opportunities were available to you, and what obstacles did you face? So I think that using these sort of images of students learning to then catapult a conversation about how the trade worked is great. Yes, they are dressed super well, right? I think that's a great thing to notice, and that they're in white coats. This is a profession, right? This is professional work, right? And so that's kind of a neat thing to observe, right? That this is not, that this is, and the fact too that it looks to me, yes, they're getting ready for the press to run, but it looks like they're like deeply engaging with those pages too, right? I don't know that they're reading them, but they're probably at least checking them to make sure that they're coming out correctly. So just to kind of, great. HBCUs demand excellence and professionalism practiced and personified, and still do. That's great. Thank you so much, Mrs. Robertson. So excellent. All right, I'm going to leave the floor open for another minute here. Just if there are any concluding remarks on this or any of the other images, and then I want to talk a little bit more about NEH and the opportunities that we offer. Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for participating in that with me. That was a lot of fun for me. any excuse to get into archives. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what we do here at NEH in relation to libraries and archives. So, as I hope you've seen, a substantial portion of the nation's cultural heritage and intellectual legacy is held in libraries, archives, and museums. And many of these exist on college and university campuses, such as your own. These repositories have a great challenge to preserve diverse formats of materials that are threatened by factors inherent in their physical structures or by the environments in which they are housed, and to create a level of intellectual control sufficient to enable users to find and use the materials relevant to them. Increasingly, these humanities collections are being used to create the kind of web-based resources that NEH supports, right? Such as encyclopedias, dictionaries, descriptive catalogs, and digital archives. And the HBCU Library Alliance that I mentioned earlier would be an example of that. Both the creators and users of these resources also need our support to develop digital tools, to enhance access, and to promote integration of these materials. So at the Division of Preservation and Access, our grant programs recognize that good stewardship of cultural resources require equal attention to both preservation and access. All of the division's programs focus on ensuring the long-term and wide availability of primary resources in the humanities. So let me offer a few examples of preservation and access support at HBCUs. Centered at Morehouse College, the Africana Digital Ethnography Project, or ADEPT, brings together faculty and students from member institutions of the Atlanta University Center, the largest consortium of HBCUs in the United States. The primary work of this 2019 Humanities Collections and Reference Resources Grant is to catalog and annotate a large inventory of born digital recorded sound, moving images, and photographs, over 40,000 files for posting in an open access repository and educational YouTube channels. The scholars involved in ADEPT have gathered extensive field recordings for a decade, with more to come before the start of the grant period, which was in May 2019. The primary means of access to the collection is through the Atlanta University Center's Robert W. Woodruff Library's open access repository. And then if you look to the right there, we see Hampton University. So in 2017, the William R. and Norma B. Harvey Library at Hampton University received a Sustaining Cultural Heritage Collections Award for their project, Wade in the Water, the Preservation Environmental Plan for the Peabody Collection. The project included site visits, meetings, and conference calls between preservation consultants and local stakeholders. The consultants helped the library to narrow down the strategic options and to select a realistic and achievable strategy and future improvements for preservation of the collection. And then finally, if you look to the center image there, NEH awarded a preservation assistance grant to the Southern University at Shreveport for a comprehensive assessment for proper long-term preservation of its Black ethnic archives. And you'll see there a photograph. So this is particularly important in terms of photography preservation. These collections, which focus on Louisiana history, include the complete run of the Shreveport Sun, the oldest African-American newspaper in Louisiana. It started in 1927, it's still running. The collections also include materials on notable African Americans in Shreveport, illuminating lives that included both professional and community activities. The papers of local activists who work with national leaders such as Dr. King to rally local support provide tremendous insights into the grassroots elements of the civil rights movement. Both the Sun archives and the archival collections also round out the picture of everyday life and community activity during the civil rights era and beyond. So those are just some of the ways in which we've been able to support HBCUs, and I hope that the conversation today has helped you to think through the ways in which we might be able to offer support to your institution. We are here to answer your questions, and we are happy to help you to find the grant program that fits best for you, as well as to read drafts, and we assist through the review process. And here's my personal information. So please feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'll be happy to either help you directly or to put you in touch with someone who's the most appropriate person um, uh, to assist you. Now I'm going to turn to the Q&A and try to answer some questions here. Again, I'm looking back at the chat, and so please go ahead and keep posting questions, and I will answer as many as I can before 2 o'clock here. Okay, great. So how do smaller HBCUs acquire grants and resources to preserve their history and impact upon the country? Yeah, actually, I'm so glad you asked that question, Mrs. Robertson, because our preservation assistance grants, which I wasn't sure that I'd have time to talk about, but you've given me an opportunity to, are a great way for smaller institutions. They are particularly geared towards smaller and mid-sized institutions. And again, they're to help you to come up with the plan that your institution needs, to hire an outside consultant, to do an assessment if that's what you need. Maybe you don't need someone from outside. Maybe you have the expertise on staff, but the person just needs the time or the resources. Also can be very helpful in purchasing supplies, right? So things like those acid-free boxes, which are not cheap, but are super important, right? Things like that, we can help with that. Environmental monitoring equipment. What is the humidity level in that archival room, right? You need to know. So we can help you to buy that equipment, which also is not particularly cheap. Or bringing in people for education or training to help your staff become better prepared. And then especially important to mention now, given the wake of Hurricane Ida, disaster response, recovery, and mitigation is a huge part of these awards. The applications are due in January, and so so the timing is really good for you to let us know what kind of needs you might have, and how those awards might help. So let's see, we've got a few more questions here. Yes, someone asked if the presentation will be available. I believe that all presentations will be made available through the White House initiative. So please check back to the site, and I believe it will all be available there. I'm writing the history of HBCU, of the Houston-Tillotson University, over 4 presidents. Can I get funding from NEH? So probably you should look at the Division of Research for that. That would be a kind of, if that's an individual's research project, that is probably the best place to look for funding. So again, the Division of Research. And again, please feel free to contact me, Dr. Martin, if that's the best, if I can send you more details about that, or put you in touch with a program officer in the research division specifically. Yeah, great. Great. So this is a great question. Are there grants for opportunities for HBCUs to establish partnerships or alignments with Black churches or denominations in need for preservation? Absolutely. We encourage partnerships throughout all of our grant opportunities. So the primary, I should say too, that the NEH can never further a certain religious agenda, which is not to say that we can't fund work that's done in partnership with churches. So either the HBCU needs to be the primary person or the primary institution on the grant, or a nonprofit organization. So someone with a 503c, right? That designation so we can fund either educational university or educational centers, right, or 503Cs. So that would be key. And yes, again, absolutely to partnerships. And please feel free to be in touch with me, Dr. King. It looks like if you'd like to ask me any specific questions, and I can help you to think through which grant program would be best. You have a list of HBCUs to send this information to. I'm not quite sure. We certainly the NEH works closely with the White House Initiative, and we certainly have a number of we NEH does consultations with HBCUs all the time. If Dr. Brown, if there's someone specific that you would like to see this information be sent to, please, please, please be in touch with me. I'm going to go ahead and just put my contact, and I'd be very happy to reach out to anyone who might suggest. Okay. So there are, okay, great. So the question is, there a packet that outlines where to begin in the history preservation process? So there are a number of resources, and some of which we've funded over the years. I think that the place that I would first send you to, Mrs. Robertson, is the Northeast Documentation Center, NEDCC, and they have some really great sort of getting you started. The other place, of course, is the Society of American Archivists, and they too have some great sort of initial some information about how to initially get started in your preservation processes at your institutions. We don't, excuse me, we at the NEH don't put out that information, but we fund the organizations that do that work to do it. Sure. Oh, happy to drop my contact into the chat. Sorry, let me just do that. If you have a specific question for me, you can also, the division is the preservation division. And so I'm putting both of those in. Great, thank you. Oh, that's very interesting. So a question from Dr. Friedman. I'm interested in preserving the histories of defunct HBCUs and struggling HBCUs. I'm working with an HBCU that's lost its accreditation. It doesn't have to be accredited, but it's got to have, again, a 503C, so it's got to be a nonprofit. It's got to be, and I'm not sure how, I think it might be best, actually, Dr. Freeman, if I could just ask you to contact me individually, because I know we don't want to sort of get into the specifics of that here. But I think the answer is yes, but I don't want to say that too confidently without having a few more details that I wouldn't want to ask you to impart in this public setting. So did I just, let's see. Oh, I'm so sorry, y'all. I sent I did that thing where my setting was wrong. So here is the, just in, to everyone, sorry, I sent it to someone in particular and I didn't mean to do that. There's both divisions access, divisions email and my email. Oh, thank you. You all are being so kind. Thank you very much for your nice comments. I'm seeing them all and they're making me super happy. I'm sorry, it's a 5013C. Excuse me. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hill. Thank you so much. Great. We have a few more minutes and I'm happy to hang out and just keep answering questions as I can. Thank you all so much. This has been so wonderful for me. A little nerve-wracking to run a interactive session over chat, but it's been really fun. I'm so glad we went for it here. You guys have been a wonderful audience. And you'll see too, some of my colleagues, including Mary Macklin, has posted yeah, that's great. I'm just going to repost Mary's comment just to make sure everybody sees it because there's so much going on and it's wonderful. But this is a resource that I should have thought of, and I'm so glad that Mary did. Of just, you can take a look and sort of start to think about, sort of what matches, what program might match. Oh, thank you all so much. Just really, really lovely comments. I'm really touched. Thank you. It's my pleasure, and so thrilled that I really do think that there's so much here, and there's so much that NEH can help support with. Great. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up with I don't think anyone ever complained about a Friday afternoon meeting that ended a little early. So thank you again so much, everybody. It's just been really my delight and my privilege to speak with you and to share this experience with you. So as I say, please don't hesitate. Please be in touch with me or anyone at the NEH. We really are here to help. Thank you.